Welcome back to America's leading higher education podcast, The EdUp Experience, where we make education your business. Hosts Dr. Joe Salustio, Elizabeth Leiba, and producer Elvin Freitas bring you the brightest and most influential minds in higher education today. We explore innovations, ideas, and issues in higher education and beyond, and hopefully have a little fun along the way. Now let's get to it. Are you using the right mix of channels to get in front of your audience? Is your messaging personalized and delivered in a medium your audience responds to? Are you spending more time building reports than listening in on what your audience wants? These are not easy questions to answer. That's why our great friends at MDT Marketing are offering a free audit of your marketing efforts. Head to www.mdtmarketing.com/edup and submit your information for your free consultation today. Look, guys, you got nothing to lose. It's free. I don't know why you wouldn't want a free audit to tell you what you're doing, whether it's effective, and how you can make some incremental changes that can make a big difference moving forward. That's www.mdtmarketing.com/edup. Welcome back, everybody. This is the EdUp Experience, where we make education your business, interviewing the brightest and most influential minds in higher education and beyond. My name is Dr. Joe Salustio, always with me by my side. She's a lady that needs absolutely no introduction, so I won't give her one today. Liz, how are you?
I was waiting for my grand introduction, but I guess I won't get one. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Liz Leiba, and I'm happy to be with you today.
Well said, Liz. Did you?
Thank you. Did you like the way I said that, Liz Leiba?
Yes, I do. You're learning. Yeah, your name has to come with a little bit of definition around it. Liz.
Liz. That's right.
It's almost like it ends with an A. Liz.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
So, interesting story. I got to tell you a story about our guest.
Gosh.
About our guest today before I bring him in.
Go ahead.
So he's been on once before.
Yes.
Okay. And very popular episode, by the way.
Absolutely.
And I won't tell him or his colleague who's also come on which one was more popular. We'll save that for another episode. But
the intrigue.
We asked him, he said, you want to come back on? And he just flat out said no. And so I pulled out my phone and I looked at my speed dial, and I got one of my boys. His name is Billy G. And I was like, I got to call my boy Billy G and see what's up. Why my guest won't come on? And Billy G's Bill Gates. I don't know if you know that, Liz. I got him on.
You have him on speed dial. There you
call him Bill Gates. I call him Billy G.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And not everybody knows that about
I
me.
did not know that. Thank you.
It's a window into my personal life. I don't talk about my high-level relationships that often because I don't want to make it seem like I'm putting off this air of elitism.
Of course.
So I was like, Billy G, he keeps saying no, he won't come back. What are you going to do? So my boy Billy, he made a call, and now he's back, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't know what happened behind the curtain, behind the scenes, but he's back, and his name is Patrick Methvin, and he's the director of post-secondary success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Patrick, how are you?
Poor Patrick. That story was painful to listen to.
I'm good, Joe. It's good to be with you and Liz today. Okay, so how about this then? I've got a story that's actually a true story about me returning on this to open it up with. So a colleague of mine came upon our more recent episode on LinkedIn, right, and said something to me to the effect of, yeah, I caught that show. The hosts, meaning Joe, you and Liz, are super fun. Love the vibe of the podcast. And I said, yeah, I agree. I'm actually going back on for another conversation in a few weeks. And my colleague says, yeah, that makes sense. And she just left it at that. And so out of curiosity or perhaps insecurity, I had to go fishing a little bit, right? And so I asked, why is that? Is there anything in particular you were hoping we'd go deeper on? And she just said, no, you just always take twice as long as you need to get your point across. So it makes sense you do another one.
Wow.
So there's the actual true story backstory here. And, it's one of those, like, with friends like these, huh? What do you need?
Yeah, I mean, all of that is really good. I'd love to hear it, except for the part where my story wasn't true, which we're just gonna leave that out, and
yeah.
maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I'll never tell. Patrick, we're honored to have you back. It's fun because the first time we had you on, it was pre post-secondary value commission report put out by the Gates Foundation, and now it's post-secondary value commission report, which I mean, it's like throwing a boulder into a still lake, right? That's the way I felt about the report, because there's so much in there about higher ed, about what's not happening. And, we want to ask you some questions and have you elaborate on some of these things for us. And I'll start, and we can do we could go wherever you want to take it, because I think there's so much in it. But equitable value is the foundation, right? This concept of equitable value. Without, for someone that hasn't read the report, let's start there. What is equitable value, and why is that the statement? Why is that the foundation?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just start with the definition there. I think the context and the history is super important, but I'll start with the definition, which is that students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. So that's the answer to the question of, like, what is it? What is the definition? There's a lot of stuff that goes with that. I think the history piece is really important, but the task of this commission was to define it first and foremost, to articulate a definition, what's underneath that. So a framework for how to think about it, which we can talk about a little bit, and then an action agenda, because it was never meant to be a report on the shelf. And we can hit on all of those, through the conversation today. I think the context in which it lands and the history behind it's super important. So I'd love to get into that if we get a chance.
Why don't you give us the background? Why talk about it? Give us what we need to know.
Yeah, so to bridge our previous conversation, maybe Elvin can come in with like one of those previously on Lost kind of things. But what we talked about last time is, the historical context. If you think about the 1940s to say the 2000s, GI Bill, community college expansion, was all about access, right? 2005-ish, you see things like the Spellings Commission come out, which say, hey, by the way, let's take a look at what's happening when students are going there. Completion rates weren't looking too great. And you saw really the emergence of the next phase, which was the completion movement or the student success movement. You saw reports from folks like Georgetown Center for Education in the Workforce saying that by 2025, 60% of the population is going to need some form of post-secondary education. And so goals were set, multiple state goals, some of them with catchy titles like Drive to 55 and Texas 20 by 30, or excuse me, 60 by 30 or others. And the reform movement really was pushing on that. Organizations were built up, efforts took place, and you actually would see an increase in graduation rates over that period of time. Now, however, a movement that addresses two things the previous phase I don't think did sufficiently, and this is what equitable values is really pushing on within the movement. One, who receives those credentials? So we can say, well, 60% of the workforce needs these credentials. Who are we talking about as receiving those credentials? That's an equity question. And the second is, what value do they produce for learners in society? So, we don't want to be in this to just start talking about credential bills. Like, what lives are those leading to? We think those two things are additive to the current completion movement and are critical to the future of this work.
It's really, that's good. Thank you for that, because it makes a lot of sense. When you go to figure 2.3 on page 31, it shows of the report, it shows the pipeline to equitable value. I thought this was significant. I mean, I'm big in graphics, right? To be able to show the steps that need to be taken for someone to achieve equitable wealth, starting with equitable access. I'm sorry. There's this equity track, if you will, right? And it goes from access all the way to wealth. There's a lot of steps in between. And a graphic like this is good because it distills those steps down to something we can understand, but it doesn't show the complexity, barriers, traditionalism, elitism that exists in our industry and higher education that prevents these steps from being achieved so easily. Talk about that just a little bit, because we're going to talk about action steps later in the episode. But is there a recognition of the I don't know how to say the lack of ease, but the barriers that exist to achieve this level of to achieve the track as it's laid out?
Yeah, so just to open that up a little bit in terms of the framework you're referring to, there's really a couple dimensions I think are important to highlight here. So that framework has elements that are focused on value to the student, elements that are focused on value to society. And that was an important concept within this, because we believe that a higher education is and should be a public good. And to do that, you need to prove out value to society. So what you see running through the middle of that are things that kind of touch on both of those. So you mentioned equitable access, equitable affordability, equitable support. So that's a lot of what the student success movement is about, in that kind of equitable supports, equitable completion, leading to equitable earnings, and then on down to equitable wealth. One of the reasons we launched the commission in the first place is the student success movement, when it referred to equity over the past couple of decades, you look at the actions and it leaned a little bit more towards what I would consider socioeconomic equity and not enough on the racial equity front. And when you start looking at measures related to equitable wealth and equitable earnings, it really pushes you to be much more intentional on race. So just an example of some of those motivating pieces of data that the commission wrestled with up front, right? So Latinx adults are half as likely to earn an AA degree or higher than a white adult, 26% to 50%, Blacks, 36%. That gets you into kind of stuff that people talk about in the completion movement. But when we go further into that and you look at wealth gaps in this country, right, an 8x wealth gap for white college educated, this is college educated households compared to Black college educated households, right? Wealth differences of 180,000 versus 23,000. That says like you have to go further than completion. Higher education doesn't own all of that. Of course, there is wage discrimination that is rampant. There are a number of other factors that are playing into that, but higher education needs to do its role on that piece. And so that's why really you see kind of that completion in through economic piece is the through line there, Joe, that I would call out. But I also want to say that the framework touches on things that are non-economic. Right. So you think on value for students that are non-economic, student well-being, we talk a lot about student learning and outcomes and skills, student social justice agenda, right? If you look at the students who are going through the system right now, think about what they're wrestling with in life. They need to be equipped to engage productively with issues of social and racial justice right now. Look on the other side of that, value to society. So there are some value to society elements that are not purely about that economic gain. We all know public health, there are public health outcomes associated with higher education. Civic engagement and empowerment, there are huge implications there. Workforce diversity and pay equity, public revenues and gross domestic product. So it's trying to anchor, yes, on that middle piece that you mentioned, but calling in these other pieces of value that you see in society and with individuals as well.
That's one important piece that you said there. And one of the call outs of the report is, and Liz, I'm going to pass it to you. I'm sorry, but let me just slide this in real fast, that 60% of likely voters agreed that college degrees are still a necessity for workers to stay competitive in the new economy. You know, and I know, and others who follow higher education know that there is a movement within higher education that is anti-degree. Many of the benefits of a degree are non-economic. It's mind, like you said, mental health and mindset and all of those other, and we'll call them ancillary benefits for the purposes of this question. Do you think, and did the Value Commission think that the part of the foundation still is degree? Is it still college? Maybe not in its current form, but the output of going to college or going to get a credential of some kind of the degree has this value that still must be identified?
No doubt. I mean, in fact, the commission had a lot of discussions on that front. How much are we talking about post-secondary learning writ large? And there's a blossoming of highly diverse sets of types of learning, credentialing, certifications that's happening right now. I think we are in a bit of a renaissance period within that at the moment. That said, this commission was pretty squarely focused on higher education. So, 4-year, 2-year degree, some credentials, but the framework was meant to be extendable to other types as well. So you could ask the same question about a boot camp saying, okay, so you want to invest this much in this boot camp, many of which, are not eligible for federal dollars. Some of the short-term credentials and certificates are not currently eligible for those dollars. So you say, you're going to invest your time, you're going to invest your money in this. What is the expected outcome? So you could apply this framework in many of those other different forms of education that are happening right now. And so it was squarely focused up front on what we would consider traditional higher education. The intent, though, was that the framing could be extended. Now, there's big data questions underneath that, right? So many of these programs, you don't actually have the data to make those connections. I mean, frankly, even traditional higher education, given the current federal ban on a student unit record data system, which would link workforce data and education data, you don't even have in traditional higher education all of the information you'd want to be able to talk about income and wealth. You see it in very unique places like the research that David Troutman did with us from the University of Texas system. They have kind of this great agreement on a pilot with census data, so they can actually link that data and ask some of those questions. So I think part of the issue, Joe, is yes, the framework is extendable to other forms. The data systems don't really support a healthy and robust analysis of that at the current time.
Yeah, it's been one of the ROI barriers that data can't be connected. And Liz, I got your text that you'd like me to keep going. Is that still the case here, that you don't?
That must have been another Liz, a different Liz in your phone, saved in your phone.
Oh no, I see it here. It's you, definitely. But we'll disregard it for now.
Okay, definitely. I have a lot of questions, and I think primarily when we think about this idea of equitable value and looking at higher education as a public good, I wonder, Patrick, if you could weigh in on, I guess, a lot of the public discourse and everything that's happened over the past year or two, especially since the lockdown. And a lot of us, I think, are a lot more aware of, from an economic standpoint, the country and the direction that we're going in. A big part of that conversation has been ROI of education, student loan debt. How do we reconcile, and this kind of, I think, goes to what you were saying before in terms of the idea of higher education being a public good. How do we reconcile that stat with Joe saying 60% of people agreeing that a higher education degree is a necessity? But then as a country, a lot of times we don't necessarily have enough funding at higher education levels to really give everything that we need to in terms of the value and the student experience. How do we reconcile that? What should we do as a sector, and what do we need to do as a country to address that gap in us understanding that higher education does create so many more opportunities and is able to improve the lives of students, but as a country, we don't necessarily have the finance or the funding available across the sector to be able to create that environment, especially when we're thinking about students that are coming from these lower socioeconomic backgrounds, whether it be Black students, Latinx students. A lot of times those students are the most likely to take out student loans because of that gap in funding. So what are some of the strategies that you think? Is it that corporations need to step in to fill in that gap? How do we address that?
Yeah, good question. I'll add a couple of other pieces of public sentiment into that as I answer your question and comment, Liz. So one of those came from Third Way in December of 2020, released a report, so broad survey report, and it cited that currently 67% of likely voters rate the ROI of education after high school as excellent or good, compared to 76% pre-pandemic, right? So almost a 10-point drop there. The same survey found that 40% of likely voters and 66% of institutional leaders believe that the pandemic has made improving the value of education after high school a higher priority. So it's in the mind in ways that it wasn't in the public discourse. I don't think you'd see those kind of polling numbers the same way as we're seeing now. So one of the things that get underneath, I think, the root of what you're talking about, which is public investment in this, is you have to have public will. And I think people are engaging with this conversation in a way they didn't before. So I think that's an important piece to call out. I think the other is, you're 100% spot on about this as a public good and the implications for different student populations, right? So when you look at the debt burden carried by Black students, which is a form of negative wealth, right? We talked about that wealth gap there. That is a form of negative wealth at the end of the day. It is burdening. And so you say, if this is truly a public good, are we investing accordingly? So you will see, in the action agenda findings, there are action agendas elements for federal and state government. Those do include increasing funding in a more equitable way, right? You look at the difference between current funding levels for institutions that are predominantly serving racially minoritized students, and you're looking at 20 to 30% less per student than in historically white colleges, right? So that's both a call for greater investment and more equitable investment. And so you'll see, and there are things that are related to, doubling Pell, some of the free college ideas. You're going to see a bunch of topics in there about investment. And, we all know at the state level, state level investment in higher education has been going down, which has then put pressure on tuition, which makes that ROI equation even more difficult for a family and almost impossible for a low income family. Because you can talk all day about, but now it's tuition free. But, the opportunity cost and the other ancillary costs for that student are exponentially higher as a percentage of their family's income than they are for middle income and high income earners. And so I think you're right. There's a disconnect there, Liz, in terms of how we're funding it and what we're saying. And that is a piece of the puzzle. I don't think, though, that we just stop there with funding. There are practices at institutions that are known to increase equitable value. There are reasons why you can look at certain colleges like a San Diego State or the Sinclair or Georgia State or others who have closed opportunity gaps by race and by income. They are creating value, right? They are increasing graduation rates, decreasing time to completion. That's investment, right? That's lowering the investment and increasing the return. And so I think it is both. There's a policy play here. There's also an institutional play.
When you saw, and I love that you mentioned specific schools that are doing a good job. When you guys were compiling this evidence and looking through all of this data, what are some of the best practices? We have listeners and college leaders and those that are across the sector that are trying to make a difference and make this sector better. So based on all the data that you've been able to look at and gather over this study, what are some of the things that we as a sector can do to model some of those schools that are able to close the wealth gap and have been able to implement some better policies and initiatives for the students?
Yeah, that is the key next step in the movement. Much like in the completion movement, it was everybody looked at the numbers. Well, first they looked at numbers and critiqued the data, right? Because the data is not what you would hope it would be. And then they tried to improve the data, and then they looked at themselves, right? And said, well, what does that mean for me? I think we're going to be in a similar space here with this equitable value movement. A couple thoughts on that. So first, later this summer, early fall, we're funding the release of a public data tool so people can actually look at some of the insights. Again, with imperfect data, this is with college scorecard data, but look at some of those insights that they can't find right now. When you do that, that's going to surface all kind of new waves of exemplars, right? So an example of that, people talk in the completion movement a lot about Georgia State and its exemplar. They've done amazing things. But they're just now catching on to the fact that folks like UNC Greensboro have also closed opportunity gaps by race and by income and are creating tremendous value. But they weren't on the main stage the same way because people are just now digging into that data. So First, I would say many of those stories of exemplars, Liz, are soon to come, right? When people take a look at that data, people ask themselves those questions. I will say up front, as I said before, that data is not perfect. The college scorecard data lacks a lot of things that you would want to see, but that's also actually part of the agenda, which is pushing for better data so we can ask these questions and answer these questions for different student populations. Now, all that said, different practices we're seeing. So this is obviously not exhaustive, but just a few thoughts. Institutions, and in some cases, state systems, balance of need-based aid versus merit-based. That's an obvious opportunity to drive an equitable value agenda, is skewing more towards need-based in that case. We know who is receiving merit-based disproportionately. We know the impacts. You could literally run it through the value equation, and you can see, like, if you want to increase equitable value, there's a balance between where you should be diverting, whether it's policy dollars or institutional dollars in terms of how they're doing financial aid. There's a bunch actually around financial aid, but I'll hop to another. Developmental education reform. Liz, in Florida, you know this work. A number of years ago, some stuff came through legislature that then rolled out to institutions. First couple of years were a little dicey there, but what we're seeing now is we're seeing increases in the number of students completing gatekeeper courses, which means they're doing less time spinning in some of the developmental courses, using up some of their aid dollars, maybe not seeing the relevance to what they actually wanted to end up, going to college for. That developmental education reform work that's spreading across the country, you see that in work in California and Texas, a number of other states, that increases equitable value. It increases value because of the reasons I just mentioned in terms of, decreasing time to degree, kind of accelerating students. And the equitable piece is you look who gets caught up in flawed assessment systems and placement systems, and they are disproportionately racially minoritized students and low income students. And so you've got both the equitable piece and the value. A couple others, just in my favorite list, again, not exhaustive. There is a data piece of this, which is institutions, if they want to increase equitable value, they're going to have to look at what's actually happening on campus. And there are some campuses, you got a campus with a 20-person IR shop. Yeah, they can analyze that stuff all day long. But if you've got, a 5,000 FTE community college whose IR person is serving half-time as the chief operating officer or whatever, they're not having the time to interrogate that data. So I think that's a critical piece in this movement as well. And there are obviously other ones, such as like the career advising. Guided pathways is a big piece of this, both on the front end of supporting college success and also linking to the labor market. So many of the things, Liz, that are part of the completion agenda, I think will very much find a home in this work as well. It's just tuning them, particularly on this equity front, to make sure the outcomes are what we're looking collectively for.
If you're experiencing any level of marketing challenge right now, you've got to ask the hard questions and you need answers. Are you using the right mix of channels to get in front of your future students? Is your messaging personalized and delivered in a medium your audience and future students will respond to? And are you spending more time building reporting than listening in on what your students really want? All of these questions will get answered when you sign up for your free consultation with MDT Marketing. Head to mdtmarketing.com/edup, submit your information, and talk to MDT. Don't go it alone. Find the right partner. The guys at MDT, the team at MDT is absolutely amazing. Whether your challenge is the cost of inquiries, your branding, the bad and incomplete information that come with your inquiries, whatever it is, an audit of your challenges will help your institution, and it's free. mdtmarketing.com/edup. I think it's worth mentioning that the economic value index and the economic value contribution, I think it was, are actual mathematical calculations that are being implemented here, that you can take these parts of the business and put them through an equation, so to speak, that spits out a number showing equitable value. And it's the first time we've seen anything like this. How significant was that to create a model to define equitable value from a numbers point of view?
So, Joe, I think the interesting backstory behind those two concepts was actually it was actually a question. It was an equity related question about different institutional segments who are predominantly serving our focus populations, who are not invested, as I mentioned before, in the same way as broader population. Specifically, you look at HBCUs and their service of Black students, HSIs, other MSIs, and we looked at that. And one of our chief concerns here was, oh man, well, so when we release this data, we're going to fall into the same traps as the completion movement, right? So you release the completion data, and then you have some folks coming out saying, oh, well, look at this. See, the institutions, they don't have as good a grad rates, and so they're not performing well. You say, well, I don't know if that's a fair statement. Let's take a look at the resources that are invested in them by states and by individuals. And then let's also look at what their aspirations are with their student populations. And that's a big, big issue from an equity perspective. You don't want this data to be used for the wrong reasons. And so those two indices that you mentioned are really talking about economic mobility and who is driving that. And when you reframe the conversation and say, who's driving economic mobility? And you saw a lot of that data from Raj Chetty a few years ago. They were looking at zip codes, they were looking at colleges. It presents a different set of institutions, right? So if you're an elite institution with 60% of your student population is coming from the top 10% economically, okay, so let's say you get an 80% grad rate. That's great. And that is very important for those students. And they will go on and have good careers and whatnot. Did you drive economic mobility? Maybe not. Maybe you retain the status quo. Now, that's not necessarily part of the problem or the solution. Part of the problem is not acknowledging that you may have an institution right down the street that, on its surface has a 40% grad rate, but what they're doing is really driving intergenerational wealth increases. That's that conversation we should be investing in. And so those two concepts that you mentioned are trying to figure out, how do we tell that story collectively and fairly for institutions that are doing the heavy lifting? And many of those are your open access institutions, your community colleges, your four-year regional comprehensives. Actually, the co-chair of this commission was Millie Garcia, the president of ASCU. She speaks about this from personal experience, right? Her amazing work at Fullerton and other institutions before taking the helm at ASCU. So that's the main reason for those two indices, Joe, is to tell the full story.
Yeah, and the full story needs to be told. One thing I picked out in section 4, which was, how to deliver economic value for the institution, how the institution delivers economic value might be a better way to say it. The piece on professors, right? 53% white men, 27% white women, 8% Asian men, and 12% all others, which all others is a number of other ethnicities and diverse backgrounds. That is it's a stat. Liz, you've brought it up a million times. You've brought it up about Black professors being a very small minority in overall.
About 5%.
Yeah. So you look at that stat, it's on paper, we see it. That's a key initiative for college and universities to be able to take action to start to create more equitable value. But it's not an easy one to take quickly, because you have people who have been hired, you have people that have tenure. If you're a traditional institution, you can't just fire a bunch of people and rehire people. There's this time that has to go by for you to even out those stats, for lack of a better way to say it. And the more time that it takes to even out those stats and the professors, the longer we see the billions of dollars of losses because of a lower equitable value for students. How is that? I don't know what my question is here, even though I did a long buildup, but is that considered? Does the commission think about that? Like, yeah, we have these stats, but to change these, it does require time, or it requires specific intention. And if we don't do it, a lot of these other areas are not going to be improved.
So let me just start with saying that I am alum of UNC Chapel Hill. And I don't know if you've been noticing in the press, but there's a conversation about that live, right?
Yes.
Nicole Hannah-Jones. And there's Twitter threads, you look at it and people are saying like, oh, well, let's talk about the truth here. And you see a whole litany of institutions talking about it, right? So I'm looking at a Twitter feed right now, 622 tenured professors in 2019 from federal. Of them, 8 of them Black women. Go down the street, NC State, 643 tenured professors, 9 were Black women. I can keep going down the list. And so we're making those decisions every day. Those decisions are happening every day. So like in one regard, you say, well, how long does it take to build to that? And I say, start today, right? There are these decisions that are happening. They're politicized already, and we need to be moving on that. And I think the reason I bring that up, and this is an interesting piece of the Value Commission work, there was a lot of assumption up front that this truly was going to be just about value from the student lens, kind of a private pecuniary gain story, right? Like, what does the student invest, where they result in? But what you see in here also are recommendations on how institutions themselves need to become more equitable. They're also massive employers, right? These are large employers. We also know that students are asking for campus climates with professors who share lived experiences as them. And so, those sorts of decisions are going to impact both the environment at the institution and actually the students' outcomes as well. And so this is a very live topic. And I recognize, I saw Liz, like on your LinkedIn feed, you were reflecting on the number of states passing legislation right now about, critical race theory and things like that. So this is happening with that backdrop, right? I mean, extremely intense period. And if the commission wouldn't have made a statement about institutions' roles in that, then honestly, I think it would be a little bit empty, some of the findings.
There'd be no accountability. That to me stands out as the one huge piece of accountability that says, look, if you want to be in the game, you've got to play. And the way you play the game here is you've got to bring the right team. You got to put the right team on the field, and the right team on the field has to be representative of the students that you're serving. And and Liz and I have talked a lot about this off recording, and we hear from leaders, yes, it's about, a value, it's about diversity, it's about equity, it's about inclusion. Then it's like, well, but you aren't doing it internally. It's one thing to be about it, and it's another thing to say you're about it, right? It's really one of those, I don't know, dissonance points, don't you think, Liz?
I absolutely agree. And I think Patrick made a very salient point in that this is something that is happening all over the country on a daily basis. And it's not necessarily something that should be looked at like, okay, we have to scrap everything and start from scratch, or, what about the people that are there? But more of, well, we have to reimagine and we have to transform. The same way when COVID happened, we had to pivot to online, and it just was what it was. And I think sometimes there is resistance because there's nothing that's making us do something, right? Because it's like, hey, status quo, let's keep things as they are. And COVID was a big slap in the face for a lot of colleges and universities across the country, where it was like, hey, we have no online program, and now we have to literally put every single student online or do something, because otherwise we're going to put people's lives in danger. So I think that equity and justice and access and these different gaps in terms of students that are minoritized, definitely, if it's looked at like this is literally life or death. And in some situations, when we think about equity, it is life or death. So if we look at our role in that same respect of being change makers and reimagining the way that society needs to conduct itself, and the way that education is a pillar and foundation for us being able to do that as societies, as communities all over the country, and I think that will definitely happen. Can you speak, Patrick, to the long game? Because I think that Joe alluded to this idea that it's not as easy as it looks, and it definitely will take time. You said that initially, that to start somewhere. What are some of the most important things that, just looking at everything, all the data points and everything that you've looked at, what are some of the most important things that you think need to change? And what were some of the highlights, or maybe even surprises, that you found from looking at all of this data?
Yeah, So it is a long game, right? So even earlier in the discussion, we talked about, where we were even in the completion agenda, and looking at some of the data in '05, Spellings Commission, et cetera. It took a number of years for the field to get geared up for it. So you say, well, so what do we do about that? And then you see folks like the Achieving the Dreams and the Complete College Americas and other organizations being built up literally for the completion agenda. So I think the first piece is to make sure that this is 100% squarely on the agenda, and that's going to take some doing. There's a lot of narratives. There are a lot of narratives that are floating around out there that are circling around a concept of equitable value. There's a lot of, the broader public is talking a lot about cost of education and talking about debt. Some of them are talking about jobs, connecting those things and making sure people can see those are all part of this broader equitable value movement. That's the first thing, and I don't think we can overlook that. And so you're going to see from the Value Commission ongoing drumbeat work related to this, and sharing examples and holding up stories from that front. So I think that's thing one, and that's going to take some time to do. Then I think you actually start taking a look at the data deeply. And I mentioned a release of a public data tool to say, well, let's dig under that and do some introspection. At the end of the day, this work is about improvement for students, which means institutions and states and policymakers and funders are going to have to take a look at the data and say, well, where are we seeing equitable value? What lessons are we learning? So there's going to be a lot of introspection, taking a look at that, improving the data itself, right? So I think that's kind of the next phase. And then it's actually getting into, not to say that people aren't doing this now, but really intentionally getting into what are the changes that I'm making, either in policy or in my institution, to increase equitable value. And that stuff doesn't happen overnight. We're putting a marker out there, and we're going to be behind it for a number of years, because that's what it's going to take. You even look at, in the completion agenda, you still have a few states that don't yet have their completion goals that are adding them now. I mean, we're 10, 15 years into that thing, right? And so we're past that first wave of 20, 30 states that set goals. We're now into a place where pretty much, I think we're looking at 35 or 40 of states are setting those. And we're 15 years in. So this is the long game. I think first bit is getting it on the agenda. Second bit is looking at the data and unpacking what it means, and then getting into that action piece.
Let's talk about the action piece just for a tad, because the significance of the action steps are, they're significant, right? So the first one that I pulled out is to interrogate and eliminate admissions requirements, limiting access. And the first thought that went through my mind, as cynical as this is, was, for some institutions, and you know what, maybe somebody's going to troll me on my social for saying this and think that I'm saying it about them, but for some institutions, that is brand diluting. That is a brand diluting statement, that certain brands in higher education are the way they are because they limit access. Now, people might disagree. That's fine. And I'm saying this is my personal view. And it's partly because limiting access it creates an air of elitism, and that elitism boosts brand. And it becomes, like Liz and I've talked about, the over the barbecue talk of my son or my daughter goes to so-and-so college, and it's looked at in this way. And if you increase access, it can be, to some people who are looking from the outside, a dilution of your brand. Cynical, maybe. Am I wrong? Am I right? What do you think, Patrick?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a luxury good. So there's some basic tenets of supply and demand that are playing out. It's the same reason that that even with highlighting, just in the completion movement, highlighting the access issues at the Ivies through things like the American Talent Initiative, I think funded by Bloomberg and others, where there's been pressure, there's been shining a light on that, but you're not seeing massive movements in terms of the diversity of the freshman class. based on income or by race. Now, certainly you can find individual institutions who really lean into that, but you don't see that broadly as a sector. It's the same reason also you see this phenomenon of these, people call them mega universities or national scale universities. These are your Arizona States of the world, your Southern New Hampshire's, your WGUs. Think about some of the elite institutions and the resources that they had, what they could have been doing. You could be serving literally 1 million students right now with some of those endowments easily. Why didn't they do that? Well, it's because of all the stuff you just said.
Right.
Right. And so and that's actually why I think you're going to see this class of national scale universities like the ASUs, who, if you look at their mission statement, they are measured not by whom they exclude. Right? That is literally in their mission statement. That's a different animal. And what are they doing right now there? They're increasing their research funding dramatically. Like if you look at the federal research dollars, you look at the number of Nobel laureates, et cetera, and they are increasing access and they're increasing success. They're saying, y'all have got it wrong. You can break these compromises. I think you're going to see different models of institutions in that space. And I'm still waiting, for one of the elites to do that. You've seen it in a few spaces. You've seen some kind of experiments, the Purdue Kaplan, you see it. But like when you look at some of those experiments that could have gone bigger at the elites, in many cases, they kind of carved off the thing. Maybe they created a MOOC and set it over on the side, but it's not going to hit their brand, right? It's, we created this public good. People can use it. We've done our thing. That's great. And so I think you're right. I don't think it's honestly that provocative of an idea.
Well, the piece of it is the piece that sticks out now, though, is with a report like this that comes out, if you don't increase or look to increase equitable value, you're basically saying with your actions that you don't want to be more equitable. Right? I mean, that's the part of this that it's like a reverse consequence. It's an unexpected consequence. Is now there's more of a light on it. So if you're not going to work to create the equity, you're basically saying that you don't want to be equitable. And what does that do to the brand long term? So either you get on board or you don't. And if you don't, it's saying something about your institution and your operations that was kind of said before, but it's really being said now. And that's the part that I think is going to be most significant out of this, is because you could say you want to be part of the equitable value movement, but are you? And there's going to be a light on it now that's never been seen before, in my opinion, because a report like this has really never existed in its totality in this way. I just think that that's going to be one of the best things about it, is that it creates an accountability, whether said or unsaid.
Well, look, I think in many cases, the most elite institutions, it's one of those not necessarily part of the problem or the solution. If you look at the number of students going to those institutions, it's not that large, right? It is a drop in the bucket. Their movement
compared to the total, compared to total higher ed,
right. I mean, their movement will send a signal to higher education. They also have very different missions. Some of those institutions, just to give benefit of the doubt from it, are driving an equity agenda through their research, right? And they say, like, this is what we're doing on global health, or this is what we're doing here. And they choose to try to engage in equity in different areas. That's for them to decide. That's why that's part of the beauty of the heterogeneity of this sector, is you have different institutions with different missions. As it pertains to undergraduate equity, yes, I completely agree. What you're going to see is they're producing graduates getting good wages, making good impact in society, but it's the lift piece, it's the economic mobility piece. They can't achieve that when you look at the demography going to those institutions. They're going to have to be more diverse and open in terms of their admissions approaches to be able to get that lift, right? Otherwise, they're kind of sustaining status quo, generating lots of value, maybe not equitable value.
The other piece, real quick, and then I'll hand it back to Liz to finish us up and ask her questions and close us out, is this issue of credit transfer. It's brought up a number of times in the action steps. Credit transfer, easier credit transfer, more identifiable and visible pathways for credit transfer. We all forget, maybe we don't forget in higher education, but the general public does forget that higher ed institutions are businesses. And in the business sense, let's take the student out of it for a minute. In the business sense, it's you're reducing cost and you're reducing time when you accept credit transfer. So you're basically giving, for lack of a better way to say it, a discount to a student who has those credit transfers. So in the past, it's been in the best interest of the quote unquote business to not accept credits from another institution, because well, frankly, you're not taking credits at my institution and I want you to take my classes. So this one doesn't quite fit. And there's just a lot of smoke and mirror around credits and curriculum mapping and whether something equals this or equals that. And I've been in the middle of all that kind of crap, for lack of a better way to say it. I call that a higher education word for the record, Patrick. But that is an important part of this process, is to give the student their due. If they've invested time and money and they want to go from one business to another business, higher ed to higher ed, give them the credit they deserve, right?
Yeah, and this gets back to a core question about incentives, which, you both asked a little bit about the long game. The long game ultimately will have to lean towards what is incentive in this country, right? So think about one type of incentive that's not a policy incentive, but U.S. News and World Report, right? What is that incenting? That's incenting the exact thing we just talked about a moment ago. When you look at the markers on that, you are looking at, what number of students are you excluding, right? That is a marker. Versus, actually one of the commission members of just an absolute all-star team on this commission was Paul Glastris from Washington Monthly, right? He's been chipping away, trying to find ways to talk about equity and value in his rankings, right? And in his lists and things like that. And so that's an implicit incentive. That's an incentive a lot of presidents, a lot of boards talk about. But it's not a policy one. Then you look at the policy one, and I agree, Joe, there's no financial incentive for an institution to really nail a student-centric version of transfer right now because of the way we fund. You could actually make the same argument about some of the developmental education stuff. Taking a student out of a 40-person classroom where you're getting paid X dollars and spreading it across 40, and then sending them on further up the chain to maybe a smaller seminar course with 15 or 20 to one professor. The economics aren't great. We got to change that. We need the economics to incent student-centric approaches. And so until some of that happens, we can talk all we want about transfer. I would throw dual enrollment. I would throw into that. Developmental education. It's just not in the economic best interest. Thankfully, we have a lot of mission aligned, presidents and provosts and boards out there who said, I don't care. It's the right thing for students. I'm going to get this right. But the water they're swimming in is not conducive necessarily to do that.
I love that you bring that up, the incentivization of student-centered models, because it reminds me of an example that Joe and I were talking about earlier. I was thinking about my teenage years at the mall and how people said Amazon could never replace a mall. And Amazon was like, we're going to have a customer-centered model where we'll anticipate what you want. You get it at your door in a day, 2 days, whatever the case may be. And literally they shuttered malls over the course of a decade. And
Liz going to the mall was an event, just for the record.
That was like
watch out now.
I grew up at the mall, but right. And my kids will never know that. They will never even understand what it means to go hang out at the mall. And I think what Patrick, you really hit the nail on the head. It's going to take those industry leaders to start to turn the model on its head and become to the point where someone that is not doing what's in the best interest for the student is not going to be a great option. Or if they are, it's going to be maybe more of a specialized. So you're always going to have your elite institutions or your big name schools, your big state schools. But I feel as though the ones that are focused on the student are going to have to be those ones that really start to dominate in order for the whole industry to change. So I really appreciate you mentioning that, because it really speaks to the heart of what it really means to promote social justice and provide that equitable post-secondary value. I loved that statement as far as those recommendations, because that's literally what, as an industry, we should be striving to do.
There's I appreciate that, Liz. There's a few other reports that I want to give a plug in this in the commission findings. One of them, it is about a broader social justice mission. There's a non-financial, non-monetary piece. Doctors Tiffany Joan and Kayla Elliott from the Education Trust wrote a great report you'll find in there. Actually, Dr. Jones now is on our team at the post-secondary team. But at the time she was at Ed Trust, they wrote a report. It was recently featured in Inside Higher Ed in an op-ed about non-financial elements of equitable value. It's really asking questions about how we advance racial equity and social justice through higher education, in addition to the equitable economic mobility. So they're talking about elements related to creating opportunities for students to engage in discourse on race, racism, and oppression, talking about training to consider language and identities, pedagogy and curriculum that fosters inclusion, a number of things that institutions can do and should do if they want to be more than about just, the talk about social justice, but to really get in a meaningful way.
That's awesome. You have provided us with so much insight, so much value today. We want to be mindful of your time, and we really are so appreciative of everything that you shared with us. We want to wrap up with our last couple questions. Just, is there anything that we missed? This report is so packed full of value. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of the report or the work that you're doing, and things that you might want to make sure that we're made aware of? It would be my first question. And then my last question would be, as someone that's so knowledgeable about this sector and all the data you've been able to gather, what do you see as the future for higher education?
And will the report change that future?
All right, double down on this. So I'll start just a couple things on the first question, Liz, about any other things that we want to capture. So I want to hammer home, this is a good investment for society. So Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce put out a report that was looking at societal benefits of this, specifically of equalizing post-secondary educational attainment levels by economic status and race ethnicity. And what they found, and there's, you can imagine from that center, there's all kinds of numbers behind this, but what they found is to do that, using the tools that are available now, different student success strategies, et cetera, is a public investment over a 10-year period of $3.9 trillion. However, when that is achieved, it would produce annual gains of $956 billion. So you get that year after year after year after year. It takes investment. Actually, that ties in, Liz, to that question you were asking earlier. It takes investment, but it is good for society at the end of the day. This is not just about an individual student's equitable value. This is also about the society. So that, I think, is important to nail on that front. The other is, I just want to make sure that we leave this conversation with a couple of comments. And the first is to reinforce that this is about field-wide improvement for students. The report and future associated resources are not intended to be like a gotcha, on colleges or universities, or even to attempt to lay a complex set of equity issues solely at their collective doorstep. That's not the intent. The intent is to advance and accelerate a much needed conversation and then action on the things that institutions can control, their admissions, aid policies, curriculum, student supports, career services, all of those things, as well as their own roles as employers and community leaders, and then challenge our policymakers and the public at large to create an environment and incentivize that as well. And then the second piece of that is, I'd say, I think people get it. You had on the show, I want to say recently, Dr. Mordecai Brownlee, the incoming president at Community College of Aurora, right? And he said it really well. He said, you've given your time at this college and we have to put you on a path to change the trajectory of your family forever. Mm-hmm. He gets it. Right. So I think back to what do I think is the future? I think the future is people like Dr. Brownlee turning that statement into action. And I do hope that this report and the following work we do provides wind to his sails.
I think it will. And we are so appreciative that you took the time to come back on, Patrick. I'll let my boy Billy G know that you hit it out of the park again.
and he'll ignore your text because he doesn't know who you are.
He's like that since you put a post out about the Notorious B.I.G. Lately, as you know that song, who's paging me at 5:00 in the morning?
My gosh,
that's what he's saying.
The hip hop trivia that comes from you is absolutely amazing. You're like a wealth of knowledge here.
It's like he's like the mad rapper when I call him. I'll tell you. So anyway, on to more serious topic. Patrick, thank you for coming on the EdUp Experience. Patrick is the Director of Post-Secondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you, my friend. It has been an honor.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. We hope you enjoyed that episode of the EdUp Experience. To learn more about the EdUp Experience, please visit our website at www.edupexperience.com and subscribe to our email list. Please share this podcast, head over to Apple, and please give us a rating and review. We appreciate your feedback. And of course, subscribe to the EdUp Experience so you're notified when our episodes drop. Here at the EdUp Experience, our goal is to make education your business. Thanks for listening.